So the topic of our TOK presentation is ethical responsibility in the natural sciences, specifically research and testing.
So our real life situation. One day we both were shopping and running errands together when we decided to check up the makeup aisle. Sarah was looking for some new makeup, and I suggested to her some cruelty-free options after learning the horrors of animal testing in the cosmetic industry. We both agreed that it's probably better to buy cruelty-free makeup, but then we also discussed that is there really a difference in just us buying one tube of cruelty-free lipstick? Will our small change really influence large corporations to change their practices? Do we have an ethical responsibility to be cruelty-free when we learn about these kind of things? So using this real-life example, we propose the following question. To what extent do scientists have ethical responsibilities in research and testing?
So before we get into the actual claims, we have some definitions that need to be established before we talk about all of our arguments. So in vivo refers to living organisms. So in vivo experimentation would be experimentation on live animals. In vitro, on the other hand, is experimentation in a controlled inorganic environment. So it would be not on a live animal, but rather like in a lab or petri dish. Genetic screening refers to testing of DNA for mutations or abnormalities that could potentially prove harmful. And stem cells are unspecialized cells that have the potential to become specialized.
Okay, so our next example is in vivo experimentation, animal testing.
So our first claim is cosmetic animal experimentation is unethical because it is wasteful, unreliable, and inhumane.
A counterclaim to that is animal testing for medical research is ethical because it has led to the discovery of many life-saving treatments and has been established as reliable in the scientific community.
So when analyzing our first claim, we looked at a number of ways of knowing, the first of which was emotion, which is obviously very relevant in this topic, as far as like the empathetic feelings that drive us to be so passionate about the unnecessary cruelty of animal testing. So when looking at this aspect, we found the examples of some commonly used animal testing methods that are still widely used in American cosmetic industry. The first of which is eye and skin irritation tests. Another one is force feeding studies and lethal dose tests, in which animals are fed higher and higher dosages of the product until they die to determine the dosage that will kill them. And the final thing is the disposal of the test subjects afterwards, which is that all the animals are killed after the testing is done, regardless of their state, usually by asphyxiation, decapitation, or
So reasoning.
When looking at reason, there's scientific research and data demonstrating the waste of cosmetic animal testing. So we actually found when researching that cosmetic animal testing is not required by the FDA in the United States, although it is in other countries like China. So this is the main reason why large corporations like L'Oreal, for example, continue to utilize in vivo experimentation, because they don't want to lose the enormous profit that they gain from those countries like China that require cosmetic animal testing. The final way of knowing that we looked at was faith, which is necessary in that we trust the scientific research to be accurate and the scientists that conducted the studies to be the highest authority in their field.
So by looking at the counterclaim, the ways of knowing we used was mainly language. Language and how this information is presented will ultimately affect the people's response to it. An example is if the question is posed, should animals be tested on to check the safety of cosmetics on the human body? It definitely has a different, more negative connotation than should animals be tested on to test the effects of a potentially life-saving drug. Another way of knowing we looked at was reasoning, as in the reason behind that there is scientific evidence and data demonstrating the value of animal testing for medical purposes. Basically, there's currently no full body system that we can use in a medical sense. There's nothing that shows us the full body system as well as using animals. And animals like mice share 98% of the same DNA as humans, so that makes it really easy. Cell cultures in petri dishes do not have all those benefits, and since it's already such an established method in the medical world, it's super reliable in that sense. So it's already been proven valuable, and the discovery of these treatments has discovered many treatments for life-saving threatening diseases. There's also the aspect of faith. We trust the scientific method to work when these scientists are testing on these animals. We trust them to use the scientific method that has been proven multiple times, and so that we can trust that the results would be beneficial as well.
So to connect both the claim and the counterclaim back to the knowledge question, we need to look at some different perspectives and factors that we need to consider within this example. So there's obviously going to be a big difference in the perspectives of the researchers or scientists or experts as opposed to like the average person who has limited scientific knowledge usually. So the researchers, because they have the information that allows them to understand these subjects more thoroughly, they have a duty to the public to tell them what they are testing on, whether they're using animals or not. So the public knows what they're condoning and they know what products they're supporting. Another thing that we need to look at, another factor that is involved here, is bias, which will obviously affect your opinion on the subject a lot. For example, if someone has a terminally ill family member who would directly benefit from the findings of in vivo experimentation, would probably say that that animal testing, in the medical sense at least, is ethical because it would result in the saving of their family member's life. On the other hand, if you're looking at someone who is like a passionate animal rights activist, they would probably say that animal testing is justified in no case, whether it's medical or cosmetic. So to connect our claim back to the real life situation, we just need to acknowledge that as consumers, we make the choice of what brands or companies to support and what is worth the effort and what will make an impact. So the second topic we're going to look at today is in vitro research, specifically genetic screening. Our second claim is genetic screening is ethical because it can make people aware of disorders that they potentially have and allow them to take preventative measures.
A counterclaim to this is knowledge gained from these genetic tests can negatively impact patients and their families when a majority of the time no measures can be actually taken.
So when we were analyzing our second claim, we looked at a number of ways of knowing, including reason, which we saw through the example of Angelina Jolie, the famous actress who recently found out through genetic screening that she carries a mutation that gives her an incredibly high chance of developing breast and ovarian cancer. She already knew that she had lost her mother, grandmother, and aunt to cancer. So with this confirmation from the statistics provided by the genetic testing, Angelina Jolie was able to take preventative measures and likely save her life, just like numerous other people have. So also, two other ways of knowing that are involved here are emotion and faith, in that patients and their families might have a more emotionally charged perspective on this than doctors or scientists would. They are, very optimistic and hopeful that the genetic testing would be helpful to them.
So when looking at the counterclaim, genetic testing screening is unethical, the ways of knowing we use is emotion. There's often an emotional sense to this because often the results of genetic screening can cause unnecessary distress because it can severely damage the emotional stability of the patient and family when they hear something that they don't really want to hear, as in a disease doesn't really have a cure, but they have it. Another thing is that we have to look at reason. Genetic testing is not a foolproof method in any case. It is not a full body screen, and results, while still are helpful, they're technically all still hypothetical. The different perspectives we have to look at this are through the scientist and doctor's perspective. They are the ones that commonly see the most negative impacts and are forced into ethical dilemmas over their responsibility for people's life choices. It is not their job, however, to impose any of their bias towards the patient. However, they should be able to provide them with enough of their information for the families to make the most sound decisions.
So another factor that we need to consider within this topic is an alternate area of knowledge, which is seen in the whole debate of the insurance company's right to refuse service if someone is seen as like a medically quote unquote high risk investment. People have been refused coverage by insurance companies because of the genetic testing results that showed a high potential for medical issues, even if they're all hypothetical and they don't show any symptoms currently. So this brings up the whole issue of privacy rights and the restrictions that could potentially be imposed on businesses and companies regarding insurance and genetic screening. So to connect both the claim and the counterclaim to the real life situation, we have to look at the situation of doctors acting unethically, even if they have good intentions. So we looked at the way of knowing of language, which is often seen in doctors having to face the temptation to withhold information from the patient because they have their best interest in mind. So because the doctors regularly witness the negative outcomes of administering these tests to patients when they have and when the tests have nothing but negative life-altering results that can't actually be impacted by any preemptive measures, the genetic screening will do nothing but cause emotional distress. So ultimately, though, even though the doctors believe that it is better for the patient if they do not know these results, they have to just give the facts and their expert opinion and suggestions, but ultimately they just have to let the patient decide what is best for their health. We saw an example of this in the movie called Whose Life Is It Anyways, which revolves around the controversy of a patient and a doc, whether the patient or the doctors have the right to decide what's best for the patient's health. So the third and final topic we're going to look at today is stem cell research, but first a little background is needed. So the value of stem cells is seen in that they are the basic building blocks of cells and that they aren't a specific type. So research can be done on them. The research that's done on them can be universally applied to all kinds of cells, which saves so many resources and a lot of time. Also, because they're undifferentiated, they can be artificially specialized to create what is needed for transplants for specific patients. And so to answer the question why there is so much controversy around stem cell research, it basically comes down to the fact that some stem cells are human embryonic cells, which raises a lot of ethical questions for people. However, it is very important to realize that stem cell research is not conducted on human embryos that were aborted in any case. All the embryonic cells used in stem cell research are artificially created in a petri dish with in vitro fertilization.
So our claim is scientists have the ethical responsibility to use their extensive knowledge to determine the ambiguous ethical limits within the scientific research and experimentation. Our counterclaim to this is because a large amount of stem cell research involves testing on embryonic cells, it is unethical to tamper with human life in an unnatural way. So our ways of knowing we use for the claim is reasoning. There is really no alternate to stem cell research because it is so versatile and useful. Our supportive claims to this is that in a Harvard study, stem cell research led to the finding of a potential cure for Stargardt disease, which is a disease that causes blindness. Another example is that doctors at Johns Hopkins who perform stem cell research has discovered that this leads to groundbreaking discoveries in transplants. They can now artificially manufacture human tissue, and that could potentially lead to the discovery of the creation of more complex organs, which would ultimately help those on the donor wait list for organs that could save them. And stem cell research as a whole has done some great things in terms of cancer treatments. This is how we found out about radiation therapy, and chemotherapy was developed because of stem cell research.
So another way of knowing that we looked at with stem cell research is emotion, because there's an obvious bias for or against stem cell research based on your own personal morals and priorities, especially regarding like religious views. So another way of knowing that we looked at is faith, in that we have to have faith in the scientists' findings and claims that stem cell research is as necessary as they say, and that they are doing the research in as humane a way as they possibly can. And the final way of knowing that we looked at for our claim was intuition, because with this topic that's not black and white, really, we have to kind of intuitively decide whether or not we believe that the human tissue that is grown in laboratories is considered human life or not.
So when looking at the counterclaim, one of the biggest ways of knowing that we used was faith, and this is the faith in religion. Because many religions believe that life starts at conception, this would make stem cell research unethical, and this often trumps the faith in science most of the time. Another way of knowing that we looked at was reasoning. From the point of view that believes that embryonic cells are human life, it is a reasonable conclusion then to deem stem cell research as unethical, since it would technically count as human experimentation. Regardless of religion, if you want to look at it in a reasonable fashion too, by following the line of reasoning that human beings are not things and their life shouldn't be tampered with, even for the sake of the good at the end, stem cell research is something that the people using those reasonings would not believe in, because they do not want to tamper with human life just to benefit stem cell research. Another way we looked at was emotion. It is that feeling that if this is an unborn child and the damages that are done to this unborn child, those are too extreme and too emotional, so that almost outweighs the potential good that can come from stem cell research. It's that whole idea that you're taking an innocent life for the possibility of saving many more innocent lives, but that's still a possibility. There is a difference, however, between stem cells grown via in vitro fertilization in a petri dish versus natural insemination and development that we have to also explore. So there are some different perspectives when we look at this. One of them we've already obviously explained was the religious perspective versus the secular perspective. Another is just the scientific perspective. Scientists that work on embryonic stem cells, they have to face different ethical standards as scientists who are trying to work on bone marrow. They're working on two different types of stem cells. However, any opposition towards stem cell research halts development altogether, because it's kind of coupled under this idea of stem cell research as a whole. With controversial issues, we found that the researchers in question must go the extra length to provide the necessary tools for their methods. They have to present it in a way that people can then value their findings.
So to connect both the claim and the counterclaim to the real life situation, we have to look at the emotional influence, like the personal bias or priorities, which we touched upon with religion and things, as well as the potential impact of future applications or ethical issues. So the research and science that we're doing now, how will that impact future problems that we might face ethics-wise? One example is human cloning, which is, although very far in the future, still relevant with stem cell research, as well as we have to look at how artificially produced human tissue compares to animal lives if we're going to compare to like animal testing, because it's a possibility that stem cell research could provide for an alternative method to animal testing.
So our conclusion. Our answer to the knowledge question is, in experimental research and scientific testing, scientists have the ethical responsibility to, 1, make difficult ethical decisions regarding when the ends are justified by the means, 2, provide evidence-based reasoning for the chosen methodology as well as the conclusion, and 3, recognize when it's not their responsibility or their right to make certain decisions for others despite their own personal beliefs.
So when looking at the implications of this conclusion for a real-life situation, we're looking back at the question that we had originally of, does buying cruelty-free products actually affect anything in the grand scheme of things? Is it like even worthwhile? So throughout this process of analyzing all of our claims, we looked at reason. As we analyzed data, we looked at emotion as we empathized with the affected. We looked at intuition as we made instinctive inferences, and finally we looked at faith as we realized that we had to trust authorities to abide by their ethical responsibilities, because if they do not, then our minute contributions would be meaningless. So by giving them the benefit of the doubt, what then does that imply for our ethical responsibilities as consumers, assuming our choices are actually impactful? This can lead to further questions such as when looking at how these concepts can be universally applied to in other areas of knowledge, do we have ethical responsibilities within the arts? Like, for example, can you still enjoy art even if you don't ethically agree with the artist? By looking at a topic that caused us to analyze the effects of our own actions, we became far more aware of the ethical implications in our everyday lives.